So, I apologize for that. I will put the videos of all the other presentations on the webpage of Rogue and the blog Naked Keynesianism and so on and so forth. So for other people to see, so you might get there a little message about that. I also want to, he reminded us of Jerzy passing, but also Julio Lopez, who was also in the book and was a student of Kalecki, and who passed, after this project, and just to remember him again, central for the development of Kaleckian ideas in Latin America, in particular. Our next speaker is a very well known Kaleckian economist, and needs no great introduction, and nobody here in this panel does. So Peter Chrysler is at the University of New South Wales, I think. He'll correct me if I'm wrong. And again, I'm going to keep you to about 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, let me say what an honor it is to speak about this book, which deals with a neglected but very important area. There's been a hell of a lot written about the debates between White and Keynes leading to Bretton Woods. And that's important because, of course, Bretton Woods shaped the post-World War II world. However, as the volume emphasises, there are a lot of very important critiques of that debate that were largely ignored. And I'm going to concentrate for obvious reasons on Kalecki's analysis and why he was sceptical of the proposals. And that's mainly from the first part of the book. I think Kalecki's main problems with Bretton Woods and the Bretton Woods Agreement stemmed from his underlying vision of the dynamics of capitalist economies, which was quite different fundamentally from that of those who were instrumental in designing it. Like Keynes, his starting point was that there was no mechanism within capitalist economies that could generate full employment. But in contrast to Keynes, Kalecki saw the uncompetitive nature of the capitalist economies, with large oligopolistic firms dominating and exerting market power as having major macroeconomic impacts, particularly through their impact on distribution aggregate demand. Markets, including, and relevance today, especially foreign exchange markets, didn't work the way conventional economics suggested, and rarely produced the balanced outcome of textbooks. And Keynes, for all his revolutionary figure in terms of macroeconomics, in terms of his micro, certainly when he wrote the general theory in many of the debates, was pretty conventional. What Kalecki concluded was that both domestic and international economies required intervention to generate desired results. According to Kalecki, capitalist economies are subject to cycles and are not capable of systemic stability. And that's quite important because underlying the Bretton Woods assumption, agreement, is this assumption that there is stability underlying capitalist economies. For Kalecki, on top of the cycle, there was underlying stagnationist tendencies deeply rooted in capitalist economies. And the only thing that can get us away from those stagnationist tendencies were either government policy or technical progress. And those could do it maybe for a bit of time, but needed to be constantly re-exerted. And exports can temporarily help individual countries, though not, of course, capitalism as a whole. Kalecki's criticism of Bretton Woods was based on the observation that this international system would, rather than helping overcome stagnationist tendencies, actually reinforce them by introducing stagnationist bias on top of the domestic ones. And that was mainly due to where the burden of adjustment to trade imbalances lay. Both Keynes and Kalecki clearly understood the importance of international trade as a mechanism for exporting unemployment between nations, believing that countries can and should use domestic policies to maintain full employment. However, if they didn't, then by generating trade surpluses, they effectively exported unemployment problems to countries with resultant deficiencies. The international battle for markets was seen by Keynes as being a battle caused by countries abdicating their domestic responsibility to maintain full employment, and he warned of the dangers of such battles. Kalecki went much further. In his paper, Multilateralism and Full Employment, He argued about the importance of domestic full employment policy, not just in one country, but in all countries, for the viability of any international system of trade based on multilateralism. In that article, he stated, multilateralism is certain to realise its advantages only if full employment based on domestic expenditure is maintained in all countries. It is certainly unworkable if employment in major industrial countries is subject to fluctuations. So what he's saying there is domestic policy maintaining full employment is insufficient without some sort of international mechanism, and particularly with some sort of international payments mechanism that reinforces full employment. And to show this, what he looked at was the example of countries that did have full employment initially, but ran trade deficits or surpluses. And for Kalecki, a trade surplus directly increases the profits of domestic capitalists at the expense of those capitalists that have deficits in other countries. And because of that, because of the increased profits, that puts capitalists in surplus countries at an advantage. And that's reinforced by what's happening on the capital account, because there's an offsetting outflow, so that countries with trade deficit become, according to Kalecki, indebted to the capitalists of the surplus country. And that then leads to cumulative impacts, reinforcing the initial problems. For the surplus country, the foreign exchange surplus increases both domestic profits and at the same time the level of economic activity. That in turn generates increased investment. The increased investment increases both capacity and productivity within the country, reinforcing its trade advantage, and that's going to further improve its current account. So we have a perfect example of cumulative causation, where the initial trade surplus leads to a virtuous cycle, further increasing advantage over trading partners. And that's reinforced by offsetting capital flows. And of course, the capital outflows generated by the trade surplus eventually need to be serviced by the deficit countries, which leads to income flows into the surplus countries, which further increases their profit and further increases their advantage. And with the exact opposite happening, of course, with deficit countries, that what we have is deficits, reducing profits, reducing investment and output, leading to vicious cycles. So Kalecki argued that we have a problem here because countries have an advantage in maintaining surpluses, and there's nothing within the international system that forces them to act on it. And the more they have surpluses, the greater the growth, the greater the employment at the expense of deficit countries. Kalecki was particularly worried about these sorts of effects occurring for developing economies. And as is documented in both the book and Jan's introduction, Kalecki was very critical of Keynes and White's discussions and of Bretton Woods for ignoring the specific problem of developing economies. And you remember, Kalecki defined developing economies as economies that have insufficient capital to fully employ their labour force. In other words, what makes these economies less developed, if you like, is insufficient capital. So they're vitally dependent on imports, particularly of capital goods, to aid the process of industrialisation. Many of them had a long way to go. So again, as Jan mentioned, any international payment system needed to specifically address the question that developing economies needed long-term, long-run trade deficits to allow them to import capital goods and other necessities to facilitate the development process and industrialisation. Bretton Woods did nothing for these economies, and the debates between White and Keynes ignored them almost totally. The fundamental problem that Kalecki came back to often in his writings with Bretton Woods, and in fact all subsequent payment systems, is that the burden of adjustment always lies with the deficit country. That means that in order to do something about a deficit, we have two options. That is either devaluation, depreciation of the value of the currency, or tight fiscal and monetary policy to reduce income. And that is going to reduce imports. We know, and both Kalecki and it's brought up in the book, that there are very strong limitations on the efficacy of depreciation to help balance the trade problems. And the limits are particularly strong. They're stronger for developing economies than for other economies because the Marshall-Lerner conditions are much less likely to be met. In any case, developing economies need capital, and depreciation reduces the ability of their exports to purchase the capital inputs they need. If they work, on the other hand, we get what Joan Robinson called beggar thy neighbour policies. We get retaliation from other countries. But in any case, certainly, let's say in the current inflationary environment, policies are likely to be resisted because of the inflationary impact of depreciation. So not surprisingly, changes in the value of currencies working through changes in prices are unlikely to be able to achieve any alleviation of trade deficit, which means that the main mechanism most countries rely on to do something about the trade deficits are via imports. How do they do that? They do that by tight monetary fiscal policy, reducing income. That reduces imports, but at the same time, it makes balance of trade problems worse in other countries, reduces investment, output, employment domestically, and it reinforces the general stagnationary tendencies of capitalism.
Peter, if you, one more minute, more or less, if you can. Sorry.
Okay, so what I was going to say is that Kalecki advocated that we need to change the burden, the nature of the payment system, so the burden of adjustment goes on the expansionary, on countries that have surpluses. And one of the things he talked about, and I think Jan talks about it in his paper quite a bit, is that he argued that there need to be change to international institutions. And he gave the example of the International Investment Board. And the importance of that is that it enables countries to engage in long-term investment. But we can summarize it in terms of a variation of the conclusion of Kalecki's 1943 paper. Remember that political aspects of full employment, where he concluded that capitalism would need to develop new social and political institutions to overcome the political cycle and maintain full employment. What he did in his international papers was argue that the international environment also needs new institutions to allow it to be compatible. And just one final point, that for Kalecki, I think the fundamental problem is that what he saw the debates about new payment systems and so on being about is the goal of trying to have balanced trade. And Kalecki didn't think balanced trade was a particularly important goal. For him, the main goal of economic activity, but also of domestic and international institutions to provide jobs for all. And so what he argued, that any international payment system needs to have as its number one goal, how is this going to help us generate full employment? And any question about balance of payments, balancing needs to be a secondary question.
Thank you, Peter. So our next speaker is Stephanie Griffith-Jones. She is emerita from the University of Sussex. She's also at Columbia at the Center for Global Development, and she is, more importantly now, a member of the Board of Governors of the Central Bank of Chile. So Stephanie, I'll also give you the, I'll write a little warning at 2 minutes, and then I'll try to not to interrupt by interrupting you when we're getting close to the end.
Well, thank you very much for your kind introduction. And I'm delighted to be part of this book and this launch. Very grateful to Jan for having invited me. I wanted also to just mention that at least I dedicated my chapter to the late Julio Lopez, from whom I first learned so well about Michael Kalecki. And he was a wonderful teacher. In the context of the Kaleckian and Keynesian traditions, the level of investment is a key determinant, not just of output and future output, as well as future development productivity, but also very significantly of the level of savings. Thus, ensuring sufficient investment is key for developed economies, but especially, as has been pointed out, for emerging and developing ones. And one of the key constraints for ensuring sufficient levels of investment and channeling it to the most productive sectors of the economy, or those where productivity is likely to increase most, is lack of sufficient levels of long-term finance. And I argue in this chapter that one effective way in which such finance is and can be mobilized via national development banks as well as multilateral ones. I want to explore a little bit in this paper the current economic context and perhaps the need to adjust in some ways the Kaleckian theoretical framework to the new reality, where the dynamics of capitalist economies today, where financial markets dominate, influence more speculative investment rather than the expansion of real capital assets. As the chapter by Jerzy Szatiński clearly put it, for Kalecki, the business cycle is an inherent feature of investing in productive capital, and he distinguishes between the first phase, where there is a lag between the income effect that appears when investment is being made and the supply effect, which appears later once capital assets start operating. And I've actually seen this, some of my more orthodox colleagues say, oh, investment, it's bad because investment is growing more than we forecast, and it's going to build up inflation. And I answer, quoting Kalecki, but also more recently Joe Stiglitz, saying, but that will increase future supply. So for Kalecki, business fluctuations and economic dynamics are embedded in the real sector of the economy. But as I mentioned, the economic dynamic in today's capitalism is very heavily influenced by the dynamics of the financial sector, which can be broadly characterized as unfettered and insufficiently regulated finance, which has a major influence on the real economy in its normal fluctuations, but in ever more frequent crises, which not only hit emerging and developing economies, but more recently also the US and Europe. And so both Keynes and Minsky saw the primary cause of business fluctuations in the operation of financial markets. And it may well be that under present day financial capitalism, financial crises are in fact determined by global financial markets and ruled by the mechanism discussed by Minsky and Keynes, rather than necessarily by those of Kalecki's thinking. So there's a challenge, I think, theoretically, to explain investment in ways that combine Kaleckian, Minskian, as well as Keynesian approaches. This, from a policy perspective, leads to the importance of finding ways to fund private investment that is not dependent on the vagaries of short-term capital, financial capital, but based on long-term so-called patient capital, as, for example, provided by development banks, which are also have the important virtue of being an important instrument of a modern industrial policy that can both channel funding to the real economy rather than speculative activities, but also channel this investment funding to priority sectors, such as those that form part of the green or inclusive transformation. So therefore, national and regional development banks can play a key counter-cyclical role from a macroeconomic perspective. And it was interesting that during the Eurozone debt crisis, Northern European governments led by Germany and Holland were reluctant to allow significant Keynesian or Kaleckian types of expansion of fiscal spending, including public investment, which was clearly needed to help boost economic recovery in the European economy. But they were, however, willing to engage as a sort of Keynesianism or Kaleckianism sandir, without saying it, it's a secret, by way of providing resources to the European Investment Bank, the largest public investment bank in the world, mainly in the form of European Commission guarantees. And this led to an increase of private resources of up to 500 billion euros to finance private investment, and it contributed, therefore, to a less deep recession than could have been in the European Union. More generally, development banks, nationally, regionally, and internationally, have become major actors. There is a sort of renaissance, if you like, of public development banks. They have over $20 trillion of assets, and annually they lend and have other transfers around $2.5 trillion, which is already equivalent to about 10% of total global investment. So they are very relevant actors. And therefore, when they're sufficiently capitalized, which is a very important factor, they have the power and ability to play both a very important counter-cyclical role and funding structural transformation, as well as contributing to financial inclusion. In some ways, this refers to Kalecki and Schumacher's 1943 proposals, to which both Jan and Peter have already referred, which examined the Keynes and White plans at Bretton Woods. And Kalecki and Schumacher pointed out that the formation of an international clearing organization, which became the IMF, would not provide the rest of the world with a sufficient supply of foreign exchange from the countries that had surpluses to the countries that have current account deficits. And so they proposed to establish next to the clearing union what they call an affiliated investment bureau, whose credit activity would assure availability of foreign exchange from countries which experience chronic export surpluses. And this is already discussed in more detail in the book, but I just very quickly want to quote from this article, where they say there is no merit in a general policy aiming at current account equilibrium for all countries, because different countries are at different stages of economic development. And a regular flow of investment from the more highly developed to the more backward regions of the world may redound to the benefit of all. And it's important they stress not just the benefits to the deficit poorer countries, but also to the surplus countries, which will be able to then export more capital goods.
Stephanie,
So then,
one more minute or so.
okay. So they argued that the currency support arrangements should be differentiated according to the level of development, and whether the country had a trade deficit because it was in the process of industrialization or because it had bad policies. Of course, these ideas contributed to the creation of the World Bank, which, of course, had an important role, but was clearly insufficient. So I think particularly these thoughts of Kalecki and Schumacher are very important in today's discussion, because they illustrate the need of having, particularly the multilateral and the regional level, much larger development banks that we now have, and that perform particularly this function. So more broadly, and here I finish, in the current context where we have high inflation, we have slow growth, and we have governments that are very tight on their fiscal policies because they're very constrained, particularly in developing countries, because of foreign exchange restrictions. And so there's limitations to public investment. At the same time, the radical uncertainty that characterizes the current moment discourages private investment. And this is happening at a time when the world needs major investment, because we need to do this major transformation to a greener economy so that it's compatible with the limits of the planet, as well as more inclusive development. And so to make this compatible, public development banks, in the spirit of Kalecki, can play a very important role, both nationally, regionally, and internationally, to help provide the necessary finance, to the necessary funding for sufficient levels of finance they will be channeled also to the right kind of investment if accompanied by good industrial policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. Our next speaker is Professor Peter Clarke. He is an emeritus professor of modern British history at the University of Cambridge. He is author of many books, and I should cite at least one that was very influential in my formation, The Keynesian Revolution in the Making, which is a necessary complement for economists that want to understand, the actual Keynesian revolution. So, with further ado, Professor Clarke. 10 minutes and I'll be the annoying person telling you that the time is up.
First of all, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Taking the meeting off. Right. I had certain technical problems, which meant I joined this webinar rather late, for which I apologize. And I won't apologize for my next point, which is nonetheless, I think, rather central, that here I am, a lonely historian amid a nest of distinguished economists, and our agendas are, I think, bound to be a bit different in certain crucial respects. And this shows up in the fact that my contribution to the volume, which we now happily have in our hands, the outcome of that conference in Paris, my chapter is rather different in focus, in outlook, from those of my colleagues who are economists. They quite naturally look in an analytical way towards the future, building on the ideas and insights that Kalecki so obviously manifested himself. References to Keynes are likewise in this context helpful in that they show just how closely, in some ways, Keynes and Kalecki were in their fundamental analyses and in the sort of insights that their work generated, and how it was, therefore, which, as a historian, I still find remarkable that they both stumbled upon a theory of effective demand at more or less the same moment in the 1930s, yet quite separately and independently, insulated from each other's by various barriers, not least those of language, where, of course, the English have always been very deficient in not appreciating what goes on in any language except English. The relevance of this to what we were talking about in the conference, the issues that were raised in the book, is, I think, very simply this, that whereas almost all the other contributions from my fellow participants, from the economists to whom I referred, are looking forward in their analysis in a way that can be immediately helpful in understanding the world that faces us today and in contemplating future courses of action. I remain the lonely historian who is looking backward. And what I could bring to the table here, and I don't want to exaggerate its importance, but I hope it was relevant in certain respects, is a perspective on Bretton Woods that sees us not so much on its implications for the future as it looked in 1944, but in trying to understand the role, especially of Keynes, in his implication in this whole process. And the most obvious point to make here is often overlooked by those of us who look back to Keynes with a present day agenda very much in our minds, that we forget the immediate context in which the Bretton Woods conference took place, that this was happening during the course of a tremendous world war, and that the fortunes of that war influenced the sort of agenda which the American government, in particular, as the main sponsor of the conference, was contemplating here. And there's a further point here, that although, of course, we're familiar with the work of Keynes by classifying him as an economist, by looking at his contributions alongside other great economists in the 20th century. When we look at what was happening at Bretton Woods, we're not looking at John Maynard Keynes, the Cambridge economist, ploughing some sort of lonely furrow. We're looking at Lord Keynes of Tilton, as he had now become, who is the leader of a delegation representing the British government. And Keynes is very crucially influenced in his thinking here, not only by his own history as a notable critic of the international gold standard as it had worked, especially between the wars, but is also seeking to protect British interests in a world that has suddenly dethroned Britain from the sort of commanding or hegemonic role that it had once played in international monetary policy and economic dealings. And I think we have to bear this in mind, that it is not coincidental that Keynes became the great critic of the gold standard at the moment when Britain was clearly in the interwar period having to relinquish its hegemonic role in controlling the process in favor of the rising economic strength of the United States. And in this respect, it sharpened Keynes's vision in one very significant way. It's already been referred to in the discussion, a part of the discussion I was able to hear after joining it rather late, which is that, of course, Britain's position had been one of great strength in generating surpluses on its balance of trade with the rest of the world, in effect, through the gold standard, exerting an influence on prices throughout the world, so that it's hardly too much of a statement to claim that until the First World War, the rest of the world was in effect trading at British prices, which suited the interests of the British economy very nicely. The shock in the 1920s and 1930s is, of course, that Britain, although, as usual, we might say, rather slow to wake up to the changing nature of the world around it, had to cope with the fact that it was no longer a British hegemony, it was now an American supremacy that would call the shots in the future. And Keynes's fundamental starting point here is a view, perhaps too benign a view, given his own sense of nationalism and patriotic zeal, that in the days when Britain had exerted a hegemonic influence in the working of the gold standard, things have worked out pretty well, not just for Britain, of course, but in Keynes's view, for expanding a world economy to Britain's natural advantage, and on British terms.
Peter, about a minute or so.
Yes, okay. The fundamental point then, which I should have come to more concisely, but I'll make it in the minute that remains to me, is that so much of what Keynes builds into the analysis offered at Bretton Woods is a pathway for American influence, as he saw it, to be exerted in the future in an equally benign way. The benign way that through Keynes's rose-tinted spectacles had seen an imperialism of free trade that had expanded the whole world economy on British terms. And the challenge, he suggests, is for the Americans to assume more explicitly a hegemonic role here in a way that they had failed to do so in the interwar period in creating the conditions of multilateral trade for universal expansion in this way. I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Peter. So our next speaker is Hanna Zimborska. She is a senior lecturer at Birmingham City University, and she has a PhD from the University of Leeds. Hanna, I again will be annoying you with, I'll send you a little message at 2 minutes and we'll say something at about 1 minute.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you so much, Matthias, Esteban, for organizing and having me here. And thank you to Jan as well for inviting me to contribute to this book. I'm very, very honored and inspired by the speakers so far. And I too would like to dedicate this short reflection to Julio Lopez, with whom we co-authored a chapter to this book. And really, my intention is to kind of pull together some of the threads that have been brought up by my previous speakers, and reflect on the question that we asked quite head on with Julio in the chapter, which is, do we need a new Bretton Woods? And I think it's quite targeted. Every now and then this question keeps re-emerging in the public discourse. We had it coming up during the COVID pandemic with the issues of vaccine inequality. We have it coming up now in the cost of living crisis of the Ukraine war. So every now and then we have that broad general reflection in the, not just in our heterodox pluralist community, but more broadly about the need for a better international cooperation. What would it be? How would it work? Some of the speakers who spoke before me mentioned some specific ideas. So what I would like to contribute here, based on our chapter with Julio, is first to start with mentioning that while we talk about global economic cooperation, we of course need to recognize certain similarities with the situation in 1944 and differences. And of course, among the similarities with the situation at the time of the Bretton Woods Agreement is the persistence of the deep global macroeconomic imbalances and global inequality. And especially true today is the weakened capacity to deal with crises in many countries, albeit the reasons for that weakened capacity are quite different today, which is what we're going to be talking about in a bit more detail shortly. And this is related to that difference in the context, the policy institutional context today, very much so, and revolves around that the issues of rising external debt levels, restricted domestic policy space in the global south. And what is very perceptively noticed by Kalecki, and this is what we talk about at length in the chapter, is his almost theoretical ideological challenge to the neoclassical or more orthodox conception of international cooperation and how that translates into those uneven outcomes of global economic cooperation that reproduce not only stagnation, as has been mentioned, but they reproduce those core periphery dynamics, those uneven power to execute policy, external indebtedness, and certain almost kind of exportation of certain practices within from within the global north to the global south. So essentially what we mean here is that there is certain push for a more almost homogenic approach to economic policy making. So how does then this matter? Well, it does matter because as most of us here present will be aware, the dominant economic paradigm in theory and in policy does not produce enough productive investment. It leads to real wage growth that's weak or even reversed in the current circumstances. And it does have very clear barriers for effective development, sustained and sustainable development for countries within the global south. And so we in the chapter with Julio look at Kalecki's open macroeconomics and how it sheds light on the limitations of the present paradigm, the dominant paradigm of neoclassical economics that dominates, or even new Keynesian economics to some extent, right, that dominates the global economic cooperation. And as has been pointed out, it is very much so about neglect of those distributional systemic analyses within economic theory and policy making that leads to this kind of reinforcement of core periphery dynamics in the global economy. And what Kalecki very perceptively noticed is he took on, so let's take one example that we talk a lot about in the chapter, which is the push within the global economic cooperation to restrain wage growth and promote low input costs as a way of securing international competitiveness. And this is something that is being encouraged within the neoclassical economic paradigm, as it arguably in that theory facilitates expansion of output by better trade balance and higher aggregate demand. But as Kalecki points out, he very perceptively sees the real-world features of imperfect competition, of the degree of monopoly that persists in the global markets as well as in the domestic markets. And he notices what is not present in the dominant paradigm, those effects on those complexities that, there are some secondary effects, for example, on wages, that lower wages do not actually affect the price of imported inputs. And therefore, those mechanisms that neoclassical paradigm predicts would not necessarily be realized in this context. While at the same time, of course, we know lowering wages has detrimental effect, damaging effect to aggregate demand through worsening inequality. And so answering the question, do we need a new Bretton Woods? Well, what Kalecki helps us notice and appreciate is that without that deep institutional change, without that deep ideological change at the back of that global economic agreement that we would have in place, we do need those radically different foundations. We do need to think about new ways, as already my previous speakers spoke about development banks, about the International Investment Board. So all of these ideas are very radically different in terms of the ideological foundations that they sit on. And that change in economic research and policymaking needs to happen before any type of Bretton Woods agreement implemented today could be really effectively designed to ensure balanced and sustainable and equitable economic prosperity across the world. And last thing that I would like to just highlight from Kalecki that is to me absolutely crucial and of course to Julio in our chapter is political responsibility that the key decision makers in the global economy have. Again, that emphasis on the political economy of global economic cooperation, recognizing the fact that we do not have a universal value-free one-size-fits-all way of developing. It definitely shines through that what Kalecki has highlighted here. We need to be more politically aware, and our economic policymakers also need to be more politically aware and honest about the ideological foundations of their actions. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Hannah. I was about to give you the 1 minute, so thank you for keeping perfectly in time. Our next speaker is Noemi Levy. She's a full professor at UNAM in Mexico. And Noemi, again, I'm gonna be at 2 minutes sending you a little message, and at 1 minute interrupting you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Jan Toporowski for inviting me to this book, and obviously the loss of Jerzy Osiatiński and Julio Lopez. I want to continue the discussion put forward by the last two speakers in terms that we need a new international financial system. And I want to look what happened in the Bretton Woods Agreement and perhaps give some ideas of what we can do. The first thing I ask myself, what was discussed and wasn't discussed in this meeting? We know that the negotiations took place between an ascending hegemon and a descending hegemon, the US and the UK. The US faced with multiple tasks, such as reconstructing Europe, stopping the USSR advancement in Europe and in less developed countries. It needed to impose full employment policies, and more importantly, to secure economic growth to impose the US condition of capital dominance. The UK, on the other hand, required more liquidity because the sterling region was falling apart and its colonial status was debilitated. What were the problems of the old order that the US wanted to overcome? Obviously, guarantee stable international liquidity to finance international trade, prevent currency wars, terminate bilateral agreements such as the sterling region and the so-called experiment, the Nazi Sachtian system, secure full employment policies to limit the expansion of communism. In this context, the negotiation starts. Keynes, based on the famous International Credit Union with the Bancor, specific rules of issues, had the novelty that the current account disequilibria should be borne by the debtors and creditors through devaluing and revaluing the rate of exchange. And I think an important thing that he proposed was that the surplus countries would face penalty of confiscation of their excess quota. This is something that at the end, they had to negotiate in the Bretton Woods agreements, and actually the proposal lost very much of its strength. The White Plan, as we know, I'm not going to go through it, only it's a United Associated Nations Stabilization Fund that a member country could buy their quota with their own money. And its main characteristic was to issue credits to balance country's current account deficit. And in return, these economies needed to deflationary adjustment. I think this was the main problem. Or as in the Keynes plan, the exchange rate was to be fixed, but there were no instruments to guarantee that, and they had to adopt deflationary policies when they asked money from the, what was called afterwards, the IMF. In this context, what were results? We know that the White Plan won based on a free trade, and it faced a very rapid crisis in 1947 because not enough international liquidity was provided. In this context, the US dollar was adopted as the international unit of account, linked to a value of gold. And the US could run huge deficits along with developing countries. The limitation of the private capital movement did not last long. The euro market, created in the 1950s, expanded in the 1960s, and bursting the Bretton Woods agreement in 1971. What were the problems of the Bretton Woods system? Liquidity was created through a current account deficit. This couldn't be sustained. Gold needed to be demonetized, and it set the grounds for a globalized financial system, including developed economies. We know that the post-war monetary order was restructured, and the US failed dollar stage. Capital market were ignited, strengthening the financial market based on financial innovation and creating complex financial relations. What was not discussed in the Bretton Woods system? Kalecki's, Schumacher, backed by Balog, propositions. What it needs today, perhaps, a multilateral agreement on a compensatory mechanism and based on national currencies that will settle trade deficits and surpluses and guarantee a system of long-term credit finance for economic growth or industrialization in developing countries. Is this scheme possible? I would say yes, if productive interdependence among countries can take place under a regional agreement in which production depends on various countries. This might be possible. I'm thinking about the BRICS, an extended BRICS system. Very briefly, what happened in the post-Bretton Woods system? A global financial system was imposed. Liquidity ceased to be a problem for developing countries. It was created in international system, and the access of the international unit account operated through the creation of local private debts convertible into debt denominated in dollars. So here we have that all countries are fighting to bring external capital to stabilize their exchange rate and somehow prevent inflationary pressures. International liquidity so dependent on private debts, which were highly unstable. Financial innovation dominated, and the exchange currency market triggered on the basis of financial innovation, promoting a strong speculative activity, including emerging and/or in developing countries. The financial system promoted income concentration in high strata groups of developed and developing countries. This was another problem of this system. What happened in Latin America? Very briefly, current accounts continued to be in deficit, operated mostly with overvalued exchange rate, because I think something Esteban will be speaking, imports and exports continued to be inelastic to the exchange rate fluctuation, therefore contained inflation. Stable exchange rate became the main objective of central bank monetary policy, which explained the combination of high interest margin with respect to developed countries. Our economists adopted the export-led model, globalized, a global as an international financial system. Although for the first time in Latin American history benefited from excess capital inflow, it didn't bring economic growth along. So what can be the ideas to reorganize the international market? First, I think it's difficult to impose an international unit account not linked to a country. Will be difficult. It's sort of Bancor and the many propositions at regional levels of proposing another currency. In this context, I think the Kalecki-Schumacher compensator mechanism could be applied. Especially important if the current extreme globalization is replaced by a sort of regionalism that we are starting to see in Latin America. And I think a second issue is that a private capital movement in the international level cannot be banned. It needs to be regulated, something that it wasn't present in the Bretton Woods system. They just limit international private movement. Thirdly, if regionalism continues to develop, financial system will integrate if there are joint productive projects. I think there is a very important thing. You cannot just impose from the above to have financial integration if there are no productive basis to it. And in this context, a regional board of investment need to be developed. At least there are several issues in Latin America, several propositions that has been put forward that has not realized because they are not regional products. And finally, I think Latin America need to see into the BRICS group much more importance as an alternative arrangement to developed countries to start to grow by their own. I'll be finished by then, and thank you for your attention.
Oh, thank you, Noemi. You were, I was about to send you the 2-minute warning. So I thank you for being really within the time. The last speaker is my co-author and friend, Esteban Perez. He is at the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. And, Esteban, again, I'm going to be annoying and stop you at 2 and at 1 minute.
Thank you. Where I'm going to be talking about Prebisch's critique of Bretton Woods and a little bit of its relation to Kalecki and Williams' ideas, which have been already mentioned by the other speakers. The chapter that we wrote with Matthias for the book is meant to be a chapter talking about Prebisch's critique of Bretton Woods, emphasizing the historical context and also the history of ideas. The main two issues that Prebisch pointed that are similar to that we find in other critiques of Bretton Woods, including Williams and Prebisch, is the importance of hierarchy of economic power and currencies, which is very present in Williams, and its relationship to the differences in economic structures. Prebisch implicitly argued, and Williams explicitly argued, that when you treat all currencies alike, you are thinking that all countries have the same economic and productive structure. In terms of context, Prebisch wrote the critique of his views on the Bretton Woods Agreement following his tenure at the Central Bank of Argentina from 1935 to 1943. He wrote 4 texts in around 1944. One of them is a volume of Money on Economic Cycles in Argentina, which is a non-published document. And by the way, I would like to just mention that Argentina was the only Latin American country that was not part of the Bretton Woods Agreement because of its policy of neutrality with respect to Germany, and Morgenthau did not want Argentina in Bretton Woods, nor did they want to receive to Argentina to receive the drafts of the Bretton Woods agreement, and that Keynes was very opposed to having Latin American countries in Bretton Woods because he said they didn't know anything about monetary theory, and it would turn the whole conference into a monkey house. The critique of Prebisch within his own theoretical thinking came at a time when he was thinking along similar lines to those of Keynes. How do countries, and he was thinking at this time how countries in the periphery can try to promote full employment while avoiding being affected by the international economic cycle, which was so important to the fluctuations, to determining the fluctuations of Latin American economies. And he devised what he called in some of his writings a national monetary policy autonomy, which consisted in expanding the aggregate demand, internal aggregate demand, economic absorption, while at the same time putting import controls in terms of import permits to avoid to isolate, let's say, the national economy from international fluctuations. The positive aspects that Prebisch highlighted about the international monetary plans was the principle of banking, that the necessary quality of credits and debits that was the basis of Keynes' plans, and the expansionary nature, and most of all, the anti-cyclical nature of the proposal. And in this sense, Prebisch contrasted the Bretton Woods Agreement to the gold standard. And his reference point at the time he was writing was basically what the gold standard regime had done in the countries of the periphery. His objections to the Bretton Woods is, first of all, the differences between the center and the periphery in terms of international power and international and economic structure. Prebisch argued that a key reconstruction of the world economy and for the world monetary system was achieving full employment in the most important countries, and in particular, what he thought was the main cyclical center of the world, the United States. But at the same time, he thought that achieving full employment in the United States would not ensure international equilibrium because it would create an external imbalance in the countries of the periphery. Due to the productive structure and dependency of developing countries and increasing imports from the United States, increasing exports of developing countries, generated an increased flow of income to developing countries, a big portion of which really leaked back to developed countries as developing countries imports. And the consequent increase in imports would generate a balance of payments disequilibrium due to the differences between the export and import elasticities in developing countries. Know that at this time, Prebisch had already sort of come up with what is called today the external constraint, the balance of payments, external constraint to growth. He thought at the same time that developing countries face important difficulties in promoting full employment due to the high import coefficients. A policy of full employment in the periphery necessarily entailed a balance of payments equilibrium. But according to the international monetary plans, debtor countries had to adjust. They could not, for example, change exchange rate or implement exchange rate variations without the agreement of the Bretton Woods, without agreement of the international community. Thus, he said, Prebisch, so this problem of such importance to us arises. Are we going to alienate for a plate of lentils our monetary sovereignty, our ability to move exchange rate in accordance to our appreciation of internal and external conditions, or are we going to delegate this private power to an international mechanism, I believe he said that when this problem arises in our country, public opinion will not accept such a decision. Those were the points of view in Prebisch, which are reflected in John Williams' key currency approach to some extent. Williams did highlight the need to distinguish sort of core countries, developed countries from developing countries, giving much more leeway to implement exchange rate variations and other type of controls to developing countries, whereas developed countries should maintain fixed exchange rate regimes. And also, John Williams made explicit the idea, and I think a key flaw of the Bretton Woods Agreement, that when you treat all currencies in the same way, you're treating all economic structures in the same way, or that countries have exactly the same economic and productive structure. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. That was pretty fast. And so we're going to open now to questions, comments. We have enough time, I suppose. We have until 11, so we have a little bit over 30 minutes for comments. So if just raise your hand, with the little electronic thing, or I see Mario. So if I can see you, that's not a problem. So Mario, you let me. I don't know if
you let me unmute here. Excuse me. I have very much appreciated what Esteban said with regard to Prebisch here, because but I would argue that the issue here was not just a developing versus so-called, industrial country issue here. Canada, right after the Second World War, as much as it was a member to the Bretton Woods Agreement, okay, never followed on, for instance, in particular, on exchange rate issues. It was a maverick. In fact, we floated the currency throughout that early period, except for a very short period between 1962 and 1970. Okay, so it's rather interesting to see here that this was an issue that the exchange rate issue was something which was not specific to let's say to Chile or or Argentina or whatever at the time, but was something that I think was much more general.
Thank you, Mario. Massimo, if you want to unmute yourself, and just to let you know, because Andres sent a message there that the video I apologize, the very beginning, my brief intro and Jan's remarks, I didn't record, but the rest will be, all of the presentations of, will be available on the website of the journal. There will be links to the blog and so on and so forth. Massimo.
Thank you very much. So first of all, thank you for all the authors of this very interesting book. I have a question on the exchange rate, which was mentioned by Mario, and maybe I would like to address it to Professor Clark. I mean, has there been any historical research on the way in which the exchange rates were set in Bretton Woods, but also, let's say, in the interwar period? Because if you look at the available information, statistical one, which I tried to do recently, you end up with if you want, an evolution of national currencies, which is quite different according to the country. Let's simplify in a certain way. It could be argued, and it has been argued, that some countries started the post-Bretton Woods period with a sort of undervalued exchange rate, which then turn them into exporters systematically, and so. But this is an hypothesis which which is not often let's say finds confirmation in the literature. It's something which is, so to speak, known, but I was not able to find any confirmation of that. So I was curious to know this point, because when we are talking about possible future system, one key point is, of course, what would be the level of exchange rates that you have to set up in the new system. So it's important to understand these things. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Massimo. I don't know if there are any others that we can accumulate. Anybody else wants to? If not, I think that the reasonable thing to do is, given that this last was addressed directly to you, Professor Clark, if you want to respond to that, and I'll leave the comment by Mario to whoever in the panel. I think that Steven may want to say something, but whoever else wants to say something about that, that seems to be the reasonable thing to have. Professor Clark.
Let me just say that I really do think that is a very interesting question. I wish I had a more adequate answer to it. The work by historians that immediately comes to my mind is the work of Patricia Clavin, especially on the 1930s, and to seize on one particular aspect of this idea of fixing exchange rates or manipulating your exchange rate. She points out how annoyed the Americans were after 1931, that as they saw it, the British government, while purporting to want to return to the gold standard from which it had recently been ejected, or recently abandoned, far from actually wishing this to happen, was in fact manipulating the exchange rate so that it benefited British industry and British exports. So we have an interesting example here of, not for the first time, politicians talking out of both sides of their mouth, perhaps. On the one hand, the old fetish of the gold standard is still upheld as the ideal. On the other hand, a manipulation of a managed currency for in this case, the British and imperial national interest is clearly what is driving policy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Clark. I don't know if Steven or any of the other speakers, Peter, Jan.
I'll let the other speakers, and then I can make a comment.
Actually, can I just interject on the point that is purely on the point that Mario raised, but I think it relates also to the point raised by Massimo. And one of the sort of contributions to the discussion of Bretton Woods at around that time, which there was Kalecki and Schumacher writing from Oxford, and they subsequently I think the way the system developed afterwards, Kalecki really didn't come back to that discussion, but you have an international discussion that moves into the sort of the Prebisch-Singer discussion as far as the developing countries are concerned, where there's a price, there are differential changes in prices which disadvantage the developing countries, and this creates the problems and imbalances. But interesting on the point of the way in which the Bretton Woods discussions were framed and ended up, the Keynes very my understanding of it, and Professor Clark may correct me on this, Keynes had this idea that if he that the system should be one essentially policed by the United States and Great Britain, and that would be, there would be a sort of shared responsibility for the international monetary system. Oscar Langer, who read these proposals, wrote in and said, well, this would of course politicize the international monetary system, because essentially governments, in order to maintain their payments position, would have to toe the line set by either the British government or the Americans, and in the end, it was the line that was set by the American government. So it's the issue of the politicization of the process, I think, is something which could have been added to the discussion, and I wish I'd actually included it in the book.
Thank you, Jan. Stephanie.
Just very briefly answering Massimo's question, I think that there have been a number of countries that have had very competitive exchange rates, basically through interventions and other measures, most notably China, and of course the Asian tigers before that. I mean, they pursued, perhaps not explicitly, but implicitly, a policy of very competitive exchange rates. And there is a literature, of course, on that. People like Danny Roderick, and I'm sure you know. And there was also a very strong debate, for example, in the US, criticizing that. So I think that actually occurred within the framework of Bretton Woods system. I don't know exactly what are the implications for a future system, but I think it's important to understand this has happened, particularly in Asia, and has been very successful in development terms. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Stevan, I don't know.
Yes, I have just a final question. The fact that Canada did not sort of go along, perhaps with the, as you mentioned, Mary, with the Bretton Woods, I mean, it doesn't really contradict what I said. What I was trying to say was the following. There was Prebisch said basically, and he was talking about developing countries. So I'm focusing just on Prebisch and his point of view about how they have to have some type of policy autonomy in order to isolate the internal economy from external fluctuations. And his solution at one point in time was import controls. And he mentioned in 1945 at a meeting of IMF, at the IMF technical meeting, that the countries in the center, by which he referred basically to the United States, because he's periphery and center analytical dichotomy, and that was not fixed. So Canada could be part actually of the periphery, did not have the luxury of increasing the money supply, let's say, like the United States did with quantitative easing, without regard to their parities. And at one point he said, we can't do this because we have a lot of these restrictions. One of them is the decline in reserves. Today you would say maybe it's the credit rating and so on. And then he went on to say, I hate controls. I hate import controls. It's not the way to go, but we do not have any other choice. So what he was trying to point in the Bretton Woods Agreement is that the Bretton Woods Agreement failed to give developing countries a choice to promote full employment. And and he focused on the issue of the exchange rate. Now, in regard to Williams' points of view, I think that Williams, when he talked about core countries, it's exactly the same idea as you'd find, for example, in terms of the basket of currencies that form the SDR that are called freely convertible currencies, of which, for example, Canada is not, although maybe Monetary Union of Canada is not part of that basket of currencies. So in that sense, I don't remember exactly where he put Williams and if he placed Canada outside the core countries, but it seemed to me that he would be willing that it will be these classification of core and non-core countries will be flexible enough to place Canada outside the core countries. Thanks.
Thank you. Any further questions, comments? Yes, Mario, by all means. And
Yeah,
then,
could I just to clarify my point?
then yes, Mark.
Maybe it wasn't, I didn't clarify it enough, perhaps. The only reason why I brought that up is because it was part of, was signatory to the Bretton Woods agreements and all that. But when it came to the exchange rate, clearly it kind of broke away from that. And the reason I think is because it's not because it was a less developed country, quote unquote, even then, okay, as much as it was because the importance of primary product exports and all that, which complicates a great deal the mechanisms in place, for countries that, I mean, if you have the core countries, which were, let's say, the manufacturing countries, USA and Europe or whatever, Britain, etc. at the time, the issue about achieving full employment is perhaps easier, I would say, than when you're dealing with countries who also have, in this case, an important component, which is primary products that they produce and export and so on. And this is, of course, a problem of many developing countries as well. Maybe not China, if you want to call it China, developing country still. Okay, but the point being that this is an issue more about primary versus, manufacturing dominated, type of countries as to why they would subscribe or not to exchange, to a floating or whatever versus a fixed. Maybe, we could debate that, but that's something that as I said, clearly in the case of Canada, it never really abided with that Bretton Woods agreement until very late in the 60s. And as I said, after that, it went off in 1970, and we're running a pure float ever since, literally, 1970.
Thank you, Mario. Mark.
Yeah, thanks very much, Matthias, and thanks very much to the panelists for some very interesting talks. My question, I think, is a little bit tangential, so I'll apologize for that in advance. But listening to the presentations as a whole, I was struck by what seemed to be, to me at least, their suggestion of important links between variously Latin American structuralism, Kalecki and macrodynamics, and I think also implicitly, because of the international focus, the sort of Kaldor-Thirlwall tradition in growth theory. Now, it seems to me that post-Keynesians typically fall, or you might even say lapse, into one or the other of those frameworks, despite the better efforts of people, including but not limited to Robert Blecker, Stephanie Seguino, Gabriel Porchile, there really isn't any sort of consensual synthesis of those traditions. And I'm not thinking here of a complete model. I'm just thinking of a common starting point, a common set of themes, and so on and so forth. So again, appreciating that it is by no means the primary purpose of the book, I'm wondering if nevertheless any of the panelists see the book as actually contributing to that end of bringing greater synthesis to some of these, sometimes perhaps too disparate traditions.
Thank you, Mark. I'm gonna have Domenica ask a question too, and then I'll open up and perhaps Gunit, that has raised the hand, and then I'll let the panelists reply. But I, will, as host, I'll take the privilege to very briefly say something about Mark's question, and then open up for the others. So, Domenica, please.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Domenica, you're muted.
Yes, okay. Now it's okay. Can you
Yes,
hear me?
we can
Okay,
hear you.
I have just a short comment, something which I have listened to in this very interesting conversation reminded me of what Marcello De Cecco wrote in his book Money and Empire on Keynes and on Keynes' interpretation of the gold standard. And he wrote that Keynes' criticism of the gold standard was indeed based on the idea of international monetary equilibrium, which was not caring about the complementarity between developed and developing countries, and was instead based on the classical idea of countries that they were similar and they were competing with each other on the same level. So maybe, I don't know whether this could be a note for the speakers, but just a comment.
Thank you, Domenica, and it's always good to remember the great book by Marcello De Cecco. So, Gunnar, I don't know, I don't see your hand anymore, but I don't know. Yes,
No,
please.
it is. No, my point, I hope I'm not muted.
No, you're not.
Yeah.
We can hear you.
My point is related with the point that I'm muted.
You're not.
Fine, you're fine.
You're
Can
not.
you hear
We can
me?
hear you.
You can't hear me.
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. No, I'm saying my point is similar to the one that has just been raised of the asymmetry between developing and developed countries. And I think that question should be key today if we are to think of another Bretton Woods. So how should it deal with this question of development? Because unemployment, poverty, they are mostly concentrated in developing countries, as well lack of capital in developing countries, which creates this problem of balance of payments that is persisting. So I would wonder, I would propose therefore that if any Bretton Woods would be proposed, it should have a clear bias towards developing countries, whereas the majority of the world's population is in developing countries. So there should be bias towards developing countries. Even how you settle the ecological question, there should be bias towards developing countries. So I would like to hear the comments of the speakers on this comment, particularly Professor Jan Toporowski. My second question is on how will this Bretton Woods be possible today, given the immense power of finance capital? You know, the state is so much weakened, far than what it was in 1945, you know. So how would we anticipate this Bretton Woods, given the strength of finance capital over the state to a point of almost colonizing the state? Thank you.
Thank you, Gunnar. Very briefly, I don't want to, I want to give the opportunity, to the authors, to presenters to respond. But I just want to say that in my view, to Mark's point of, I always thought, I was telling Jan at the beginning that I read Kalecki in my undergraduate. I asked him if he had met Kalecki, and he had not met Kalecki. He was at university in '68, and Kalecki was in '69 in Cambridge, as he told us, and he didn't meet him, and he didn't know about Kalecki by the time he initiated his career. We had it in Brazil from the beginning because Maria da Conceição Tavares used to teach Kalecki, but very much in the spirit of the Latin American structuralists, with the notion that there is an external constraint, and in trying to form a model of economic growth that it's demand-led. And what I think comes from that tradition is Franklin Serrano's super multiplier model. So I do think that the divide is less, sort of evident in the super multiplier model. That's my bias. So I don't think of those as being separate traditions, although there is a neo-Kaleckian and a Kaldorian sort of school. But I think there are different ways of looking at those things. And I'll be slightly more critical of whether the neo-Kaleckian school is really following Kalecki necessarily on the growth theory. So, but that's another discussion, I suppose. So, any of the authors, we have questions, and Mario's clarification, Mark's question, Domenica's comment, and Gunit's 2 questions.
Could I actually?
Yes, Jan, you were cited directly, so you should have.
Yeah. Could I start that by saying that this issue of the role of the developing countries in the international monetary system, what's missing always in any of the new discussions is a proper and realistic discussion and effective institutions for debt management, and the ability. The treatment of debt is left to the markets when developing countries can borrow, and then the developing country, then the IMF and the World Bank stands by ready to lend, and then it's a fairly penal process. I think the whole the whole idea of debt management for developing countries it needs to be unpacked, and not just in the sense of debt forgiveness, but how you make a system effective. Debt forgiveness works in the public sector. It doesn't work in the private sector. On Domenica's point, I'm actually very pleased that she raised the question of that she raised Marcello De Cecco, because I do recall on one occasion Marcello De Cecco, who had a rather sardonic way of expressing himself, saying, talking about Bretton Woods and the international monetary system, and saying that saying about Keynes that the problem with Keynes was that when he came to Bretton Woods, he'd forgotten everything that he'd written in the general theory. I remember then asking him afterwards, what did he mean by this? And Marcello, in his very characteristic way, was very cryptic and waved it away. But I think that there are issues about the way in which the internal management of the economy is coordinated with the external management, which really needs tying up more. I think Professor Clark was absolutely correct that to some extent Keynes's hands were tied when he went to Bretton Woods, because he was representing a government. It was a diplomatic position. It wasn't